COSA, and I'm pleased to welcome you today on COSA's behalf. Just a moment to do a housekeeping item before the webinar begins. Please use our chat box for questions or communications during the webinar today. We'll be monitoring the chat box during the webinar. We'll also be using it for the question and comment period with our speaker. So now I'm going to introduce our moderator for today, who is Kathy Popovich with the Illinois State Archives. And Kathy, we're really glad to have you here as our moderator. And with that, we'll let you take it over.
All right. All right, thank you, Mary Margaret. And again, on behalf of the Education and Training Committee, I want to welcome you all to this session of the COSA member webinar series. We are very happy to welcome back Dr. Sharon Leon, who was also our presenter last month. And if you missed last month's presentation, it's currently available to view from the COSA website. Dr. Leon is a faculty member at Michigan State University and is well known in the field of digital publishing. Today's agenda, we're going through the welcome right now, and then we will get to our second phase of project management, which will focus on the actual project execution. And then after that, we'll go into some Q&A and some housekeeping, upcoming programs, and webinars announcements to close out. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box. And with that, I will transfer things over to Dr. Leon.
Thank you, Kathy and Mary Margaret, and to everyone at COSA for allowing me to come back and talk to you again a second time. So we are going to talk about, there we go. I have a tendency to over-advance my slides. I apologize for that. Today we're going to talk about sort of the nitty-gritty of executing projects and project management. We talked a lot in our last session about planning and preparing for the process of well-executed project management. And today we're going to talk about the actual details of how to do that. And that means that we're going to cover 5 general areas. We're going to talk about functional work plans that you can actually use in the world, how to track your work with your team, a little bit about managing personnel issues, and setting up day-to-day operations in a way that makes collaboration smoother, let's say, a little bit easier to execute, and the process of reporting when your project is complete. So a little bit of refresh from our last conversation to say that we want to remember that project management is really a process that is one that is undergoing continual refinement and requires the project manager, you and I, to learn at every step along the way from the work that we've already done and the work that we're undertaking. But it is best to view project management and the skills that are associated with it as applied to specific discrete projects. That is not to say that they cannot be generalized to everyday management techniques, but we want to think about working on particular ventures, and that the kinds of things that we're going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so are really designed around the idea of focusing on completing a particular set of tasks. So when we talk about work plans, there are lots of different variations in the way that work plans are formed and communicated in the world, and they serve lots of different purposes. Probably the kind of work plan that we're all most familiar with, because it is sort of a natural part of a project proposal or pitching an idea to an administration or funders or something like that, is a narrative work plan where one tells the story of how a project will be completed. By necessity, these are actually the least specific kinds of work plans that we can deliver, because that sort of sentence form doesn't mesh nicely with the sort of line item spreadsheet kind of detail of work that might happen on a day-to-day basis or even a week-to-week basis. But these narrative work plans are really nice for showing the arc of a project and the possible way that the work is going to flow over a year or two or several months or things like that. The next most specific one is what I like to refer to as a phased work plan, and that is one that says that we've decided that the work for this project logically falls into a certain number of categories that can be sequenced or roughly sequenced chronologically. And what that means is that you would describe the sum total work for that phase and how it will be done, and assume that the phases move forward in a kind of logical order. That's not to say that a phased work plan might not have elements that are proceeding concurrently, but the idea is that the work has been chunked into logical divisions that are not necessarily driven by product, but maybe by kind of work. So you could have a planning phase, you could have an assessment phase, you could have a description phase, you could have a content development phase, an outreach phase. You want to put those kinds of phases generally in order. The phased work plans also often have kind of a narrative structure to them once the phases have been described. The third kind of work plan, and it is the most detailed of the ones that are most commonly seen, is this notion of a calendared work plan. And that is that you have a period of time in which you can execute your project, and you can actually go through and say, in January we're going to do these 7 things, and then in February we're going to do these 7 things, and so on as you move through the calendar. It's possible to do that, dividing not by months, by quarters, or by weeks, those sorts of things. But the idea is that this looks very much like a bullet-pointed list of activities that might be organized by the kinds of work that needs to be executed. But it really is designed to be kind of a much more specific line item description of how things are going to proceed. Now, the issue with all of these work plans is, well, there are 2 issues with them. Of the narrative and the phased, they give you a general idea about how the work will unfold, but not really a roadmap for the day-to-day work that you will have to oversee. The problem with the calendared work plan is, though it may be the most specific, the idea that one could write a very specific calendar that flows over the full trajectory of a project and have that be an accurate representation of the work that needs to be done and when it needs to be done is very, very difficult. It's very difficult to lay out that line item detail over a long period of time and have it not purely be guesswork. So what we want to suggest is that creating a functional work plan requires us to do something that sort of drives a middle course amongst these 3 possibilities. And so what I would say is that functional work plans are work plans that help a project manager break down the work into logical chunks and then into more useful details. And so I like to think about the ways in which this division of work comes to be described is as stemming from the deliverables for the project. What are really the main elements of the work that need to be completed at the end of the project? Will an entire collection be described and digitized? Will a digitized collection make its way to the web? Will a preservation plan be completed? So to say that we look at a project and it has, so 2 to 4 deliverables. Those are the major big buckets of work that we know that we have to get done and that we have to work with other staff to complete. No matter what, those wholesale deliverables are too large in themselves to describe the work that needs to be done. They are a large unit that will require further detail and elaboration for the work plan to be created and executed well. And that's where I like to think about the next step as being creating what is known as milestones. And milestones, for most people, just look like targets on a calendar that you want to hit the completion of a particular amount or kind of work by this day. I think that's not the best way to think about them. Well, I like to think about milestones as the component parts of particular deliverables that are then laid out in a chronological sequence and that are indeed tied to a particular due date. But to say that the milestone and the content of the milestone drives the due date as opposed to the arbitrary due date telling us what the content of the milestone would be. So in the notion, in a situation where you were describing a new collection, milestone number 1 might be the survey of the collection, and milestone number 2 might be the description of a certain segment of that collection. And so what we would say is that those milestones give us smaller chunks of work to think in and to shoot for. You can see we're sort of working down in a pyramid here as we go from milestones to what I, for lack of a better term, call elements of the work. These are the major components and features of a particular milestone. So as we move through the process, you can see we're becoming more and more specific. And so those elements, being the smaller components of the milestones, also can be sequenced and not necessarily tied to the due dates, but hopefully done by the milestone due date. And then those smaller elements can be broken down into particular finely grained tasks, individual steps that need to be completed. And so those tasks can then be ordered and selected by staff. Now this sounds like a lot of breaking down for the project manager to do, but I would suggest to you that once we get to the milestone and element phase, the creation of the work plan really should be a collaborative process of the people who are doing the work, so that when we get to move from elements to individual tasks, we have individual members of the staff deciding what those tasks should be, what the grain size of the description should be, and how they should be ordered. But in each of these cases, what we're doing is we're taking a really large segment of work and bringing it down into smaller pieces that are manageable pieces for us to grapple with. And in grappling with them at those manageable sizes, we can start to use a number of systems to help us track our work. There are innumerable project management software programs available on the web and off the web. And so it's not terribly useful to talk about particular software programs. But what I would say is that they all have some common features. And those common features are really very important. So I have spent a lot of time in my management career using a piece of software called Basecamp. There's another free version called FreeCamp. Lots of people like things like Trello or Asana or Jira. All of these are web-driven systems that allow both the project manager and the staff on the project to share a space for tracking work. This provides the project management team and the project manager in particular with a well-needed, super important bird's eye view of what is happening in all elements of the project and how the work is being executed along the way. So what this means is that the common features of each of these programs is it allows for a space for each task to be described, for due dates to be assigned to them, for them to be sequenced so that work is being completed in a logical order. They often also allow for the integration of files. So one could include the project proposal and any sort of functional documents that would be necessary for the entire team to share. They often have a bird's eye view calendaring screen that allows you to see sort of the big picture of what is due when. And in some cases, they also integrate messaging. But at the simplest level, what these software pieces do is allow us to create to-do lists and to mark those elements as complete as they are done. It seems like not a very complicated software system or set of needs, but the sheer fact that everyone in the team can see how elements of the work are being completed and what is being completed by whom and when allows for the team as a whole to have a sense of how the project is going, perhaps when a coworker might need extra support and help because things are not unfurling at the rate at which we would like, or those kinds of things. The other thing that it allows is, since everyone has access to the software and to the files and to the calendaring, it can really reduce the amount of follow-up and small detail attention that you as a project manager have to put into making sure that everyone is on the same page. And so simply in providing a central repository for all of that information frees us up to do more of the actual work of the project and less of the detail management of the project. One other feature that is common to these project management software is that lots of them allow for time tracking of tasks, so that each staff member could say, I am completing this to-do today, and it took me 20 minutes, and then I worked on this thing for 2 hours, and those sorts of things. As you will remember from our conversation last time, one of the hardest things to do as a project manager in planning for a project is actually estimating how long things are going to take. And so this feature of allowing everyone to track the amount of time that they invest in doing their work is really beneficial to smooth and efficient planning and executing of projects going forward. It also allows for individual members of the team to have a much better metacognitive sense of how their work is actually going. Not everyone who works on a project has this larger sense of where their work fits and how their own work styles are affected by collaboration and the kinds of work that they're doing. And so by making all of this information visible, it helps everyone understand how that they can work more efficiently, or to see where there are bottlenecks and those sorts of things. I also know that in my case, as a manager of a software development team that is composed almost solely of introverts, including me, having this shared system where folks can check in and monitor how things are going along the way reduces the need for lots of conversations and meetings that not necessarily everyone wants to have. And so it allows what I like to refer to as surveillance, but in a positive way. So project management software systems are primarily virtual. They exist in the cloud or on a server and those sorts of things. So that means that everyone can travel and keep track of work, can be at home and keep track of work, and all of those sorts of things. There's another approach called a Kanban board that is very popular and is not virtual necessarily, though there are some virtual systems. And what this is a giant whiteboard composed of basically 3 columns. The first column is the work that needs to be done. This is the stuff we are working on, tasks or elements described at whatever grain size makes sense to you. Usually we do this with Post-it notes. So column number 1 has the Post-it notes with all of the open work. The middle column has the Post-it notes of the work that is in progress. So when we move something from column 1 to column 2, we're actively working on it. And then we move it to column 3, the completion column, when it is done. So that means that anyone who comes into the room with the board can get a current snapshot of the status of the work for the group. It's publicly visible, so there's no hiding that we haven't started work on this project. If this particular element of a project has been in the in progress column for a month and a half and is not making any forward motion, that's kind of a red flag that we need to address how what's happening there and maybe break it down into smaller tasks, those kinds of things. But it's a very low-tech way to keep track of what is happening and where. And so, obviously you could divide that board into individual projects and tasks per project, and just keep moving those Post-it notes from left to right across the board. All of that suggests to you that the elements that are important here are everyone can see it, everybody can see where we are, and that the tasks are well described. So in my own group, we undertake this project and this task of describing and monitoring the work in what I like to call a modified AGILE approach. So AGILE is a style of development and management that comes out of the software world, and it can be very complex. And one of the most important things about doing this kind of work is to not let the complexity of your system defeat your system. So we work with what I call a modified AGILE approach. And what that means is that we work in 2-week sprints. That means that we have 1 meeting every other week, actually 2 meetings every other week. At the beginning of the sprint, we have a meeting where we sit down together as a team and select the work that is going to happen over the next 2 weeks. These are the important tasks that have to happen next for us to move forward on our milestones and our deliverables. Each member of the team publicly claims the work that is theirs, that they are going to undertake in the next 2 weeks, with the assumption being and the hope being that when we get to the same spot 2 weeks later, all of those tasks will be completed. Doesn't always happen that way, but we try for that. And, things happen, obviously, that mean that the ideal of having everything completed by the end of the 2 weeks is not always achieved. But we have a pretty good sense of the timing and the amount of work that will go into a task. So the idea in describing the tasks for the work for the 2 weeks is that we want to get in the practice of describing work at a grain size that it won't take longer than 2 weeks, so that we can say that we get to the next meeting that this element is completed, this task is completed. So by bringing the size of the work down to those 2-week chunks, we assure that that we achieve a sense of accomplishment as a group, and that we are regularly checking in on how things are going. So folks who work in a full Agile shop write their tasks, their stories, and assign them a point value about how complex they are and how much time they're going to take. So one member of your staff may take a very, very high value, high point value task and only take that one for the 2 weeks. Someone else in the group might take 6 or 7 with a lower point value. But the idea is that we've selected enough work to keep everyone busy for the percentage of time they can dedicate to that project in the 2-week period. So for a full Agile approach, the next thing that is required, and we very rarely do this, but some shops do, is a standing meeting every morning where everyone in the group checks in for a few minutes to say what they're working on and where they might need help. Because my group sits around a table together all day and talks to each other all the time, are pretty much in constant conversation. We have scrapped the daily check-ins. But for folks who have lots of different balls in the air, and that quick daily check-in can be really useful. So then at the end of the 2 weeks, we get to the end of the 2 weeks, fast forward to the end of the 2 weeks, we have what is known as sprint review. And that's where we go back and everyone shows off very quickly what they've accomplished in the last 2 weeks. And it is also a place to reflect upon what should come next. And so then we sit down again after sprint review and write up the tasks that we might want to move on to going forward so that they may be selected at the next meeting. And so what this means is for all of the projects that I manage, we have this sort of every 2-week meeting in which we come together and decide really what we're going to do to move forward in the next 2 weeks, all in the service of completing all of the elements that need to be completed to achieve our milestones. There we go. So in order for this to work, we have to have a fairly good sense of how the team and the group works together. If you are someone who has an awful lot of direct reports, people who answer directly to you and only to you, this is easier. It's much easier when you have full control over someone's time and how they approach their work. It's not true for most of us. Most of us don't have full control over the time of the people that we're working with. But whether you do or you don't, for personnel issues and project management in this kind of approach, good time management skills are absolutely essential, which is why I made a point of pointing out that time tracking piece of the software. If people haven't been asked to pay really close attention to these kinds of things, it can be hard at the beginning for them to write tasks or to-dos for themselves that are of the right size and of the right detail to adequately execute the work. But with practice, that skill can be improved. And so usually if folks are struggling a little bit with the writing of the tasks so that they can be selected, I like to sit down with them and write some together because you know, that's part of the learning process. But I think it's important for everybody who's working on the project to take ownership and control of the ways that that they frame the work that they're doing, so long as the work gets completed and the deliverables are satisfied throughout the course of the project. The other thing that personnel management issues come up with in relationship to this kind of work is coworker relations. Because these processes make it really clear that we're putting front and center how everyone is working every day and how the progress on the project is moving forward on a regular basis, it can heighten some coworker tensions if it feels like some people are not pulling their weight or completing the things that need to be completed in order for everyone to move forward. And those tensions are difficult, but I would say that because all of this is public, there is a little bit of an incentive for folks to move forward and to feel a little bit of pressure about falling behind if they're not keeping up with their coworkers. And sometimes, you know, inevitably there will be, you know, project freakouts. And those kinds of things are about, sometimes about just not having a good enough sense of where the work is going or those sorts of things. I like to, if I have time, like to think that it is useful to have pre-scheduled individual check-ins with each person on the team. I do them like everything else, I do them every 2 weeks for my direct reports. But if you were in a situation where you were working with a lot of collaborators who were not direct reports, as project manager, it's nice to at least monthly have a 15, 20-minute just sort of one-on-one special check-in meeting to make sure that things are moving ahead in the way that they need to. I like to ask, how things are going, what you would like to do differently, and whether or not there's anything I need to know. And those 3 questions really do help open up communication about how things are happening on the project that might not be clear in larger meetings. It also means that if you've got someone you work with who tends to panic or wants to talk to you about everything all the time, they learn to hang on to those little list of things so that they can have an individual conversation with you and not necessarily be in your office all the time, so that they learn to moderate and hang on to those things a little bit. So personnel management is not also always about managing the team that you're collaborating with. It is often about running interference with administration and other managers and those sorts of things to try and protect the time of the team as they are working on the project. And I would say that there are entire courses that we could take and conversations we could have about managing up and managing laterally. And but for protecting the time of the specific project, it's really important as a project manager that you have a sense of the, what I like to talk about is the mutual benefit society of project management, is that we have to have a sense of how to communicate the ways in which having an administration and other managers invest in the success of your project is important for the entire organization moving forward. And so to approach conversations with those folks about the project and the work on the project from that respect starts everything off on the right foot. If there's not already a deep sort of sense of trust and empathy in that structure, that's a little bit harder, but boy, if we can work to heighten that, it will make things better. So in the planning and tracking of work, we get into the notion of what do our day-to-day operations look like, and this is the point in the day today where we want to sort of have some real reflection on what your day-to-day work culture looks like. Are you with a team who is easily collaborative? Do you spend a lot of time together co-working, or are you in your own little offices and you don't communicate a lot? Not only how deep is your communication and your culture of communication, but what form does that communication take? Are you speaking face-to-face a lot? Are you chatting on Slack? Are you being swamped by email? Just sort of what is the status of the many channels of project communication that you manage? How are your meetings going? Are meetings a disaster? Are people resistant to meetings? Are they places where people do other work because your meetings are drone on in a way that people find them not productive and not useful? What are your channels for feedback as a project manager? Where do you hear when things are going wrong or where we're heading for a pothole? those kinds of things. How do you collect that data from the folks that you are working with? And then finally, where are your predictable bottlenecks? Where do you know in the work things are going to break down and you're going to get stuck? Can you reasonably predict that some unpredictable project is going to be dropped in everyone's lap at least once a year? You know, those kinds of things. Taking a survey of what the current working conditions look like and the culture of the team looks like will go a long way to helping you shape some norms for your everyday operations and communications that will help you execute your projects well. So there are a variety of ways in which we can look at shared communication norms and meeting procedures. Again, this is a set of decisions that you really have to make with your team because the only way that they work is if everyone agrees to them and everyone uses them. And so you may set a set of shared communication norms that everyone agrees to that will help you spend, again, more time on the work and less time on playing traffic cop as a project manager or as having everyone spend, you know, a third of their day dealing with their email as opposed to doing their work. So they may include rules about how you use email or Slack or Instant Messenger, if Instant Messenger is still a thing, and when you do these kinds of activities, so that we may have rules about protecting sort of work-life balance issues, so that you as project manager not be emailing the team in the middle of the night and freaking them out. Those kinds of things. And given the changing and kind of much more flexible work schedules that many offices have, the idea that you might commit as a team to overlap hours, hours where everyone is available and working even if you are not in the same physical space, but time during the workday when you know you can reliably be in contact with one another. The other possibility, and I think important intervention to make here, is to have a set of sort of regular meeting procedures that really govern the way that meetings are called, why they're called, how they're called, and how they move forward. And that may be decisions about how large the meeting is, that, you know, under no circumstances will we have an all-staff meeting unless X. How frequent they are, what your meeting agendas look like, because you should have a meeting agenda, and what the notes and follow-up procedures look like. So let's take a look at some examples of these. So many of you may have seen several years ago a campaign called Save Our Inboxes. And Save Our Inboxes was a campaign to reduce the tide of email that we all dealt with on a daily basis. And it was a single web page that included the 10 points of this email charter, and it was available at emailcharter.org. Well, emailcharter.org no longer exists. The domain has gone out of business, but I have a screen snapshot of the 10 points. Unfortunately, does not fit on a slide in a readable way. But what I would say to you is that really, as they suggest here in point number 1, is that respecting everyone's time is the number one way to reduce the amount of email that we deal with. And so that means that we not unnecessarily CC everyone, because for every person who is copied in that email, you may or may not have a contribution to the conversation, and it extends response time. That we try hard not to automatically reply to all. That we not run 25 reply emails, that we craft emails and responses that are specific and not open-ended. So clarity is hugely important. That we write subject lines for those emails that are really very detailed and very clear. Sometimes the information in the subject line is all the information you need, and that we note that this is just for your information. Here is your message just in the subject line, and that we be clear and frequently clear about emails to which we do not require or expect a response. I would add to this in this way that one of the elements that's not on here is that we take some time to respect when those emails are sent, so that that we only send work email during the work day or not after 8 o'clock at night or those sorts of things. There are a number of tools for most email accounts and platforms that allow you to write an email and set a trigger time so that it gets sent in the morning, just sort of to respect people's out of work space, even if, like me, you're an insomniac and do work a lot at night. So another way that we may manage this kind of communication and collaboration is to not assume that everything has to be eternally recorded within email. And that is to say that you could use something like Slack or IM for those real quick day-to-day check-in kinds of questions that keep everybody in conversation and that keep the small details in a place where you can get a quick answer and not have to call a meeting. That kind of low-level conversation means that communication happens on a consistent way and in a consistently recordable fashion, but doesn't have to be included in a meeting. And so here is an example of a set of communication norms that my group came up with many years ago that may not, just an example for you to take a look at, that we would agree that we'd use an out-of-office message and carefully craft subject lines, that we would be signed into what was then IM, which is now Slack while we're at work, so that we could be reachable, but that if we were in a meeting, we would set an away message and other people would respect that. That meetings be scheduled by survey or in person, not necessarily by email because that's just too hard. That we would try to make them consistent days and times so that people could prepare a calendar that was consistent. That we not have a meeting without an agenda and that the agenda had to be circulated ahead of time, and that we have a day without meetings. We had overlap hours between 10 and 2 p.m. so that everyone was in contact at that point, but that their lives might suggest that they work from 10 to 7 or from 7 a.m. to 2 or whatever, but that in between that they would be available. So those are just some examples. Other sort of useful workflow kinds of questions here are this piece from the Harvard Business Review that asks us whether or not we should really have a meeting. And I suggest that you really spend some time going back and reviewing this, because often a meeting is not the right answer. Often some of these other conversations and communication tools will be quicker and more efficient. But if we are going to hold a meeting, this is a super handy checklist to make sure that that meeting goes well and is prepared for and is productive. And that means that the right people are coming, that you have clearly identified the purpose of the meeting, you have a clear agenda, that people have had the ability to review the agenda and make additions to it, that you have a space, that you have the equipment that you need, and that everyone who's a key participant is prepared for the meeting and prepared for how the meeting will unfurl. We'd say that the preparation checklist for the follow-up to the meeting should be just as thorough. Have Has someone taken notes throughout the meeting so that we have a record of what happened? Are there a clear list of tasks and agenda items going forward? Is there a sense of whether or not we will need to meet again, or whether or not we will need to break things down into a smaller group and do some subcommittee work, or some paired programming, or some co-working? And so those kinds of things shared in a collaborative space like a project management software means that even if people are not available for the meeting, they can review the process and the decisions of the meeting and make best use of what is really expensive collaborative time. So all of this contributes in a day-to-day way to moving us from deliverable to milestones to elements to tasks completed to elements completed to milestones achieved and to deliverables delivered. What that means is that along the way, as a project manager, it's probably going to be your job, and it should be your job, to report on the process of the execution of the project and its success or not success. And so reporting is really important both for external stakeholders who may be, an outside funder or legislature. It could be anyone in an external role. And what those folks want to see us do is deliver our project on time and on budget. And to do that, all of these tracking techniques and monitoring techniques help you avoid the potholes that can put you over time and out of budget. Now, sometimes, obviously, there are things that come up that are beyond your control that are going to mean that you can't deliver on time and on budget. But you can do the best you can to mitigate those circumstances by having a careful sense of where the process is. Because when you start to see things go wrong, and you can start to anticipate that you're not going to make time or you're not going to make budget, having a good reporting relationship with those external stakeholders is really important. No one, whether it's an outside funder or further up in the administration, no one wants to find out at the end of a project period that things haven't gone well and haven't been going well for a long time, and no one had raised a red flag. So we want to be honest about how the work is going, both for interim reports and summative reports, always putting our best foot forward. But all of the data that is collected in these systems about the tasks and the to-dos and where things are in the status of the calendar is fodder for, is rough draft for putting together those reports in an informed way. It's always better to have more detail at your disposal than less. And to say for internal stakeholders, for you and your team, it's worth saying at the end of a project, what lessons have we learned from this project? What do we know now about what it takes to do this kind of work, how much time, what the resources are, where the possible bottlenecks are, and also to assess what things that we have learned skill-wise from the project, so that everyone has a sense of what the work on the project has added to their day-to-day ability to do their jobs and to fit into the organization and the profession, and how you and the staff and the project as a whole has grown through the period of performance and hopefully in the successful execution of the deliverables. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Kathy for Q&A.
All right. Thank you. That was great. It's time for any questions or comments. Please feel free to use the chat box. And I guess to kind of start the conversation, I really liked your discussion of the work plans and creating the functional work plan. I know a lot of times when we try to tackle a project, it can seem overwhelming at the beginning. But then when you kind of break it down into those smaller tasks, it seems more manageable. And then kind of the reverse, when you're in the middle of the project and you're working on all these little tasks, you think, what is this doing? Where am I going? So it's nice to look at the broader view of those deliverables. But one question I had was, as far as contingency planning, things are going to come up and projects are going to take a different route. I guess to what extent do you integrate contingencies into your work plans, or what do you recommend?
I think that's a great question. As we talked about in the first session, this notion of the fog principle of estimating, whether it's a fact, an observation, or a guess, in trying to figure out how we're going to plan for time-wise what we're going to how much time we're going to leave to execute the work. And I think that the closer we are to working from facts from previous work, obviously the clearer we can be about this. But in that estimating, the notion is that there's always going to have to be some sort of expansion joint. And so then the question is whether or not, as project manager, you clearly articulate that to the team. Because it may depend on how much leave your team will take with the pre-planned, oh, I hope this goes okay, kind of expansion joint. Because if they're going to take all the time that is available to them, if they know that they've got an extra 3 weeks in case things go wrong, often they'll take it. And if you have an idea that we can use that for an additional feature or for circling back and improving some piece of the work, it may be best not to clearly articulate that in the public work plan, because so what I would say is that sure, you have to you as the project manager have to have in your bird's eye view some views that are yours only. And that suggests that there may be detours along the way. But the other thing I would suggest is that sometimes it's really not beneficial to try and plan past the elements of the milestone stage early. It's you want to break them down a little bit, but not break them down too far past the milestones at the beginning. Because then it can look like things are set in stone in a way that they're not. And that makes people really, really, really nervous. And so when contingencies do come up, I think if things are planned too tightly, there's panic.
Oh yeah, and when you get into the work too, you might find a different way to reach
Absolutely.
a milestone that's more efficient.
That's right. And so that's that principle of working in those sprints, is that we reevaluate every 2 weeks. There might be a more efficient way to do this. Oh, maybe we should do this piece first because it'll help us do something else, so that nobody feels like the plan is set in stone at the beginning, that it moves and flows with the skills of the team and the contingencies as they come.
Great. And then I guess another question, this is kind of more of a broader question. I know we're all doing a million things at once. Any tips for handling multiple projects?
Right. Well, so all of those projects, all of those project management software packages are set up specifically to allow you to do that, so that you can see multiple at once. And so I think that that's a really helpful feature, simply being able to have one place where you can look at all of those things. And I think that having a clear sense of whether it's going to be a modified Agile approach or something else about the structures of the scheduling will help with the juggling. And so that you can start to try and balance the calendar and those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. We've got one question here from Barbara. What approach did you use before Agile, and how has your use of modified Agile improved your work on projects?
Excellent. That's a great question, because the approach before Agile worked for me, but didn't work for any of the programmers that I worked with. We did at that point even have, you know, a big group meeting every 2 weeks, but it was not as clearly about planning the work and claiming who was doing what for those 2 weeks. It was more about larger grain size deliverables and more of a review of what was going on than it was a planning for the next thing. And so they felt like the review was kind of a waste of their time because they knew what they had worked on, and that they weren't getting enough direction or enough concentration on what should have to happen next. And so by putting that selecting and describing of the what happens next in their hands, they are much more engaged with the process and engaged with approaching it in a way that is the most efficient for the way that individual works or that group of programmers work. Because it makes no difference to me how they execute the work as long as it's executed well and works. And so meetings went from feeling like they were a rehearsal of things of the past to being real useful planning. So I can't say that we used a system that actually was a system. It was just like, oh, we should have a check-in every 2 weeks. And having a check-in every 2 weeks was useful for me, but not for them.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Leon. Thank you for another wonderful presentation today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, and to everyone for sticking it out through the 18 slides or however many we've got here today.
All right. With that, I am going to turn things over to Mary Margaret.
Thank you, Kathy. And thank you once again to Sharon for a really fascinating presentation, both part 1 and part 2. We really do appreciate that. We are going to click forward here, and believe it or not, we are almost here for the annual meeting. COSA-NAGARA-SAA Joint Annual Meeting in Washington, D.C., now only a couple weeks away. And this slide, again, is just reminding you of our schedule. Tuesday on August 14th will be Archives on the Hill, which is going to be the invitation advocacy event to talk to the legislators about archival matters. The 15th, August 15th, will be the Great Idea Exchange Day and Work Session, and it will have the business meeting and awards dinner, and we now have the location for that. It's going to be at the National Archives Museum. Thursday, August 16th, the plenary session, including awards ceremony 1 and the silent auction. And then Friday, August 17th, another plenary session with the awards ceremony 2. So I know everyone is looking forward to these events. And we are continuing our webinars. And so after all these events happen in Washington, you'll be able to tune in on August 23rd, and we'll have a wrap-up with the COSA committee chairs and other leaders who will describe the events of the annual meeting and other news from that meeting. On the 27th of September, we're going to have another SHRAD town hall, and then the final member webinar for 2018 will be Mentoring Future Leaders with some of our award winners on October 25th, so you'll look forward to that. And Barbara's asking everyone to send info about their silent auction items for the meeting. So now we're going to click forward here and talk about our Shop Talk webinars. We had one last fall with Family Search. These are our major corporate sponsors, and we have 3 lined up for this fall. September 13th will be Ancestry, October 16th will be Preservica, and November 15th will be Apex. And so we really encourage you to stay tuned. We'll be sending out announcements for those, and I'm sure we'll have some good information for that. And Barbara's bringing bourbon for the silent auction. Who can top that? Well, I'm a Kentucky person too, so I'll say no one can top that, Barbara. So we want to thank our 2018 sponsors and funders. Thank you. Ancestry, Family Search, Apex, Preservica, LibNova, Space Saver, Gaylord, Archival, and the federal sponsors, NHPRC, and IMLS. Don't forget, there's ways to stay connected and informed with COSA. Our website, www.statearchivist.org. Our resource center available at that website. Check the link listed here. Our Twitter handle, we have a lot of good information coming out on social media at State Archivists, and our Facebook page, facebook.com/Council of State Archivists. Lots of ways to keep up with what's going on through those means. And we do appreciate your feedback as we talk about. We are having more webinars planned, and it's always information that we can use that you share with us after you attend our webinars. After you exit the webinar today, you will be automatically taken to an online evaluation. Please take a couple of minutes to complete the survey. Help us plan future webinars that you would be interested in. So with that, we're just now at the top of the hour again, and I once again want to thank Sharon Leon for a fabulous presentation, Kathy Popovich for being a great moderator, and for everyone who's been with us today to participate. We do appreciate it, and we'll see you next time.